Hi everyone and welcome. It's great to see so many of you here today, and we're going to be tackling an incredibly important topic today: how to improve inclusion in the workplace. We expect this webinar to last no more than an hour, and we'll send through the recording afterwards. If you have any questions, please do add them to the Q&A box, and we'll try to run through as many of them as possible at the end. We're also going to send through a feedback form after this webinar as we seek to continually improve our webinar series on diversity and inclusion, and we firmly hope you enjoy this session. So today I'm really lucky to be joined by two fantastic speakers. Our first speaker, Frank Douglas, was named by the HR Most Influential panel as one of the top 5 movers and shakers for his consulting work in culture and inclusion as CEO of Keras Executive. He's promised not to pull any punches today, so I really look forward to hearing his thoughts on such a broad and challenging topic. Our second speaker, Celia Fraser, is an analytics and strategy leader at Capital Group and was recently named a Yahoo Finance Top 100 Ethnic Minority Role Model. She'll be sharing her personal experiences with a particular focus on the measures that both have and haven't worked to improve inclusion in the workplace. We hope that it will be a highly informative session today and that you take away some immediately actionable insights. Before I hand over to Frank, I'd like to quickly introduce Instant Impact and to set the scene. Instant Impact are internal recruitment specialists. We provide the people, marketing, technology and expertise needed to help shape and deliver recruitment strategies on everything from global workforce planning and remote onboarding to, most relevantly for today, diversity. And whilst diversity and inclusion has been a key focus for Instant Impact and the broader HR community for years, it's been brought to the forefront for many teams as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement recently. This webinar on improving inclusion in the workforce follows our last webinar, where we ran through our 3-part methodology for driving diversity through recruitment. You can find the full recording for that session online, and you can also access our Diversity Hub for a number of bite-sized resources on those topics if you're interested. As an example, the video on influencing internally looks at the mindset shift that's needed to influence senior stakeholders and how to convince them on the business case for improving diversity. Themes that I'm sure we'll touch on today as we focus on a different but inseparable topic: inclusion. Alongside improving the diversity of the talent that you hire, how can you create a culture of inclusion and ensure that you have a level playing field for your employees, regardless of ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic background, sexual orientation, whether they're able-bodied or disabled? With ONS research showing that the people of a white ethnicity are paid an average of 21.7% more than those who belong to an ethnic minority in London, and only 9.7% of executive positions being filled by women in the UK, it's clear that we have an awfully long way to go. So with that in mind, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Frank Douglas. Frank has been recognised as one of the most influential HR directors in the UK, having been the only black male group HR director in the FTSE 100 and 250, and served 6 years as a first ethnic minority non-executive director of the CIPD. As CEO of Keras Executive, he now helps companies to improve leadership, diversity and inclusion through transformational HR programs. Frank, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. And I'm not sure about that picture, but suffice to say that's not my normal everyday dress. So thank you. And thanks for joining in today. So the first thing I would say is that if you're expecting to come out of this with some silver bullet to cracking diversity and inclusion in your organization, you're going to be disappointed, because this conversation is probably going to be about me asking you more questions than you asking me questions. But a little background. While I'm based here in London, I've been in London for the last 17 plus years. I was born in the US. And I was born in Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, Mississippi, then and now, is the poorest state in the US. It has the lowest reading average in the US, and it has the lowest per capita income in the US. My father was born there in the part of Mississippi called the Delta, and he grew up as a boy picking cotton and living through the racism of the South, of having colored-only water fountains, hotels, and restaurants. We then moved to the South Bronx, which I would not say was necessarily a step up. The South Bronx in those days was the murder, the rape, the robbery, the aggravated assault, and the arson capital of America. Not a minor achievement. And indeed, in those days, 40% of the South Bronx was either burnt down or abandoned. I had the fortune of having a slight talent in music, and I played trumpet. And I was allowed to audition and selected into a highly selective school called the High School of Music and Art, which many of you may know as the Fame School from the movie. As I told people, I can't pick my leg up to my head, and I only play the trumpet now to annoy my family and clear out the room when I want to have a webinar. And because of my poor upbringing playing the trumpet and getting into music and art, which is, you know, people from all over the 5 boroughs of New York auditioned for, I came into music and art with a slight disadvantage. I didn't have the resources, the musical tutorial. My trumpet was an old beat up trumpet. I probably played about a quarter of a note off tune, but I played it anyway. And my other fellow trumpet players, they were all men at that time, came with much more access to music teachers, better instruments and such. So I had a music teacher, Mr. Joseph, and the issue in music and art was for the every other day you would get 30 minutes tutorial on your instrument. Mr. Joseph recognized that I didn't have the same access. I didn't come from the same privileged background of having music teachers for 10 years. So instead of giving me 30 minutes of music tutorial every day, he gave me 90 minutes on the days that I had classes with him. And right then and there, not realizing that to probably 20, 25 years later, when it crystallized in my mind, was the first issue that I would like to present to you, was that because I came from a background where I didn't have access to the best music instruments, best music teachers, the talent, the rehearsal halls and such, Mr. Joseph gave me 90 minutes of practice. So the rule was 30 minutes for everyone. He gave me 90 minutes. And that's the first lesson that I learned as I went back on my youth days, is the difference between equality and equity. Equality would have been to give me 30 minutes of trumpet lessons every day. Equity was to give me 90 minutes to help me bridge that gap of having less resources and not having the sort of tutorials that many of my fellow musicians had to bring up to that point. And so the first thing I would say, as we as human resource professionals, many of you, we kind of believe in the sense that, you know, equality is what we're aiming for. Well, indeed, the more important thing that we should be aiming for is the issue of equity, which is providing the resources to those who need it the most. And by so doing, it also challenges, which ultimately is what I do with my work and with my business partner, Jennifer Powell, is that we basically challenge the myth of meritocracy. And so that myth of meritocracy tends to be embedded in the HR systems around the issue of equality. As I just showed with my upbringing in music, there is a difference between equality and equity. And I think as HR professionals, we need to understand that and look at our policies and understand and recognize and implement them in a way that addresses that issue. The other thing I'm going to challenge you with is the issue of inclusion. Most organizations have a diversity and inclusion initiative of some sort. It tends to be Band-Aids, quite honestly. It's employee resource groups. It's probably unconscious bias training. But the fact is that very few companies outside of my clients are actually focused on inclusion. And I'm not being pedantic, but here's the issue. And the issue is, what's the difference between assimilation versus inclusion? Most organizations, and I would dare to say most of your organizations, are focused on assimilation. Now, what's assimilation? Assimilation is we get this diverse group of talent into the organization and we onboard them so they can quickly understand how we do things. And we create initiatives and focus to help them get into our system, understand our way of doing things, and so we can mold them into the sort of people that we are. That's assimilation. The infrastructure, the policies, the leadership behaviors, they're all a given, they're fixed, they're not really changing. What's going to change is we're going to onboard and create an environment to help this diverse talent pool get up and running in the way we want them to run. That's assimilation, and that's what most companies are doing. Inclusion, on the other hand, is we're going to take this diverse talent pool and we're going to challenge our leadership behaviors, our leadership approach, our HR policies and procedures, our engagement and communication approach. We're going to challenge those, question those, and we're going to change those infrastructure, those givens that have been with us for 20, 30, 40 years. We're going to change that infrastructure to adapt to this new diverse talent pool we have so that we can take advantage and maximize the collective wisdom of this new group of people that are coming into the organization. Very few companies are really focused on inclusion. They are focused on assimilation. And therein is where the issue and why, in many ways, the dial has not moved. Let me also address the issue clearly from May 25th and such, and on many corporate agendas has not been the issue of Black Lives Matter. And why is that important? And what has caused that awakening? Well, I won't go deep into that, but I would say what, in one way, what's happened since the 25th of May is that we've understood, or we're starting to understand, that the lived experience of Black and Asian staff, citizens, is different from the dominant white majority. So I'm going to give you a little quick test, very quick. Give yourself a point if you can answer yes to any of these questions. So the first question is, have you ever felt endangered because of the color of your skin or your nationality? Give yourself a point if you can answer yes to that. Second question, have you ever had a visa declined based on your heritage? And that includes an Esther. Give yourself a point if you can answer yes to that. Third question, have you ever needed to put on an accent or change your hair to be accepted in the workplace? Give yourself a point if you can answer yes to that. Next question, have you ever anglicized your name to get ahead or to make others feel comfortable? Give yourself a point if you can answer yes to that. I can give you a more series of questions, but those are 4 questions. Many of you probably have no points on that, maybe 1. But the other point is that many of the people in your organization probably have 3 or 4 points of those 4 questions. They live in a different world, and the organizations are now coming to realize that their lived experiences, what they bring to work, the issues they live with, don't fit into the monolithic approach that most organizations have. And so many organizations are now trying to get a deeper understanding of their Black employees. I won't go into why that still has some issues related to it, but nevertheless, it's just a quick statement to show you that there is a difference. It is a difference, and it's why, if you wish, at its most purest level, what the Black Lives Matter movement is about. It's about the fact that Black people live in a different universe than many of their white colleagues. Here's the other thing, the other question I'm going to challenge you with. Many organizations pay McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, you name it, they pay millions of pounds to help them get a grasp on their current strategy and how they can change and what they need to flex in order to outperform their competitors. The city analysts would call it alpha performance. Alpha performance is outperforming your competitors. Beta performance is just performing on the average with your competitors. McKinsey, the Boston Consulting Group, Wharton, Harvard, you name it. But let's stick with McKinsey. That's the household, that's the gold-plated name in consulting. McKinsey has written a host of reports, as other academics and consultants, that say, if you crack, if you wish, gender diversity, you're 18 to 20% likely to outperform your competitors. And most conversations actually stop at that. Most conversations stop at the gender part of the McKinsey report, and that's a conversation unto itself. But the more compelling part of the McKinsey report that says, if you crack gender and ethnic diversity, you are 35% more likely to outperform your competitor. 35% more likely to outperform your competitor. Now, if you pay McKinsey, your millions of pounds, and McKinsey says, if you wish, you need to turn 10 degrees left and you will outperform your competitors. 9 out of 10 companies having paid McKinsey that money will turn, if you wish, 10 degrees left. This is the one case, and this is the question, and I would say might be career limiting, but when you go back to your organizations, the question for group HR directors and CEOs is, here is data supported by a multitude of other studies that say if you pull this lever, not just gender, but gender and ethnic diversity, you're likely to outperform your competitors. Indeed, if you came to your CEO tomorrow and said, boss, I got something that's going to help us outperform our competitors. In the pre-COVID times, David, most likely, would have put his arms around you, hugged you, given you a high five, given you a promotion, a corner office, and your career be off and running. Why? Why in this one situation don't CEOs believe the data? Why don't CEOs believe the data in this one situation? Everything else that comes out of McKinsey's or Boston Consulting Group's or Harvard and Wharton's mouth is gold. Why, in this one situation, don't they believe the data? In my mind, it's corporate negligence, it's board negligence. Because you have the ability to outperform, have alpha performance, and very few CEOs have grasped and mobilized their organizations into that strategic imperative. So I have a bunch of recruiters here, and my time's running. So for the recruiters here, here's the other thing I've realized. One of the key metrics for recruitment, and particularly outsourced recruitment, but even internal recruiters, one of the key metrics is time to hire. I throw this back at you. I believe time to hire is a barrier to diversity. Time to hire is a barrier to diversity. Why? Kind of obvious, you think about it. Because you're being measured on how quickly you can fill that vacancy. And the quickest way you can fill that vacancy, if you wish, is through your traditional network and resources. And the traditional network and resources in the UK are typically white males and white females. That's going to be the quickest thing. That's what you've grown up with. Those are who you know. That's your network. To go find that minority male or female, it's a non-traditional network. You're not very well known in it. You're not very familiar with it. It's going to take more time. And more time contradicts with time to hire. And so I would challenge you in the recruitment profession to really think about and reflect on, does time to hire actually enable diversity in terms of the talent pool? And then the last thing I would say around culture, and I know I'm kind of over my time a little bit already, Rob, so I'll wrap it up. The last thing I'll say about culture is that in my little simple American mind, I always say that, you can describe your culture in many different ways, but one way you can describe your culture is the worst behaviors you tolerate. And put another way, those behaviors that you ignore, you actually empower. And so in many organizations, be it this banter, it's just, oh, that's Sam over there, that's the way he talks, he's harmless, he doesn't mean anything. When you look at your culture and your organizations and you're thinking about inclusion, although most of you are thinking about assimilation, you also need to look at what are the worst behaviors we tolerate as an organization. So I could go on. I'm going to stop because I know Celia has some really important and insightful things to say, but the HR profession is a key part of the issues of inclusion. I would challenge you to say, how much are we really focused on inclusion and how much we really focus on assimilation? And indeed, if we were focused on inclusion, you know what you would be doing? You'd be turning upside down your onboarding process. You wouldn't be spending 100% of the onboarding process helping that individual understand you. you would change that onboarding process to find out what does that individual need to be successful, what can we do to help them, what are their expectations, what are their barriers, what are the issues they're dealing with, what's their mindset, what's their lived experiences, what's their fears, what's their aspirations. How many onboarding processes are geared towards understanding what they need and then flexing the organization to their needs? And so in conclusion, the word inclusion is a very used word in just about every organization. And unfortunately, I'm going to close this by saying, in fact, inclusion is not actually what most organizations practice. It's assimilation. And if we really want to change the dial and move the dial on this, we need to take the step back, stop marking our own homework, stop perpetuating the myth of meritocracy, and really understand that assimilation is a totally different beast than inclusion. Thank you, Rob, and thank you for listening.
Frank, thank you so much for that really challenging and thought-provoking talk. Very much looking forward to the questions that I'm sure everyone's going to want to ask at the end of this presentation. So guys, just as a reminder, the Q&A box at the bottom, please do put your questions in there and we'll have an opportunity to ask them at the end. Time now to move on to our second speaker. So if I just share screen quickly. So our second speaker is Celia Fraser. So Celia leads the Capital Associates of African Descent Network for Capital Group Europe and has been recognized as a Yahoo Finance Top 100 ethnicity role model for her work both inside and outside the workplace. Celia, thank you so much for joining us. Really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks for having me, Rob. And I'll do a quick intro before delving into some of the points that I want to share today. So by way of introduction, I grew up in Birmingham, spent the first 18 years of my life there. Both my parents are Jamaican Windrush descendant parents. After my first 18 years, I went to Houston, Texas for 4 years on tennis scholarship. Had a great opportunity of living over in the US and can compare it to my experiences here. I had many opportunities growing up that I'm well aware other Black children will not have had. Both of my parents are academics. That has its benefits and its downfalls at times, but it definitely meant that I had opportunities I'm aware other children didn't, which will have afforded me to get to where I am in my career today. To differ from Frank, I think it's important to call out I don't work in diversity and inclusion. It's not my day job. And I know at some point I'll touch on kind of the structural difficulties that many Black employees have, and one of them is the fact that a lot of people that end up doing some of the D&I work that we get involved in, it's side of desk, it's after hours, it's on weekends, and if we're talking at a really high level of some of the obstacles that the system presents itself in, that's definitely one of them. My background is analytics, finance, risk, and data, kind of a mesh, a hybrid of those roles that I'm doing currently at the moment. So I'll probably lean towards the need for some data and quantitative data, as Frank pointed out. We seem to shy away from metrics and data in this space, whereas we drive our businesses on them for other things, whether it's sales or the bottom line or marketing campaigns, whatever it is. We use data for everything else. But when it comes to talking about diversity and inclusion and where are the Black associates or where are the female leaders, what are our numbers, we don't seem to want to talk about it. So Rob reached out to me and asked me to talk about a few different areas. The first is personal experiences of racism at work. The second is some of those structural challenges. And the last one is kind of what measures I've seen work in different organizations. And I think for me, one of the things that I find really interesting or important is that I'm still relatively early on in my career. I get involved because I think it's important to try and make a difference alongside the day job, alongside doing any of the data science work that I do and data analytics. I look around and there really aren't that many people like me doing the jobs that I do. And whilst in some spaces it might be getting better, not necessarily as quickly as we'd hope. So I think when I get to the level of the career that Frank is at, many years down the line, I would like to look back and say or see when someone else is in this seat talking about it, actually the leaps and bounds that we've come on in this space. So I'm fortunate in a way that the experiences of racism that I've had at work are pretty limited, and they're definitely more beneath the surface. But just small comments like, well, I don't really see you as black, or you're not really like black. What do we mean by that? Is it because I've got attributes that you normally associate with being a successful white man? What is it that kind of takes away from the fact that you see me as a black woman? Personal distances, I guess I never invade anyone's space whenever I'm in the office, but I think when I speak to the majority of my black female colleagues, someone at some point's touched their hair, someone's touched my hair at work. It's kind of almost, again, people accept it, but it is a bit uncomfortable. It shouldn't really happen. People need to realize things like that shouldn't really wash. On kind of dress down Fridays or just generally around the office, I've been mistaken for a cleaner before, and these kinds of examples don't really filter out. I think there's kind of the view that the more senior you get, that this won't happen, but I've spoken to managing directors before, and a mentor of mine said she went into a room for a meeting that she was co-chairing, and on entering the room, one of the people sat at the table, it was a white man, and said, "Oh, excuse me, sorry, we've only got still water, can you bring some sparkling," thinking that she was part of the catering staff. So I think the idea that you can outgrow this, or you can get successful enough that it won't impact you, is a complete myth, and it's going to follow you around, because for some people, the first thing they'll see is your color, not any of your career achievements. So I think moving on from that, what kind of the structural challenges, why are some of these things happening? I think for me, one of the key things is the networks that companies have, are set up normally or quite often by those disadvantaged groups. So you're asking people that are already disadvantaged by the system to then tell you all the solutions or ways around these things on top of their day job to then drive company change, which is nigh on impossible, because a lot of the times the people in the networks are the ones that know there's a problem, and there's only so far that message can reach before you realize that you're actually not reaching the people that you need to, which is often the middle managers who don't have an interest in anything to do with diversity. I think it's fair to say. So whilst it's imperative to engage your senior leaders, you also need to make sure actually it filters down the company. I think often you get employees that are really invested in this space and wanting to drive things forward. You do get some really engaged senior leaders that also understand that it's imperative, as Frank said, that if it directly affects the bottom line, there's plenty of research out there that shows that you need to be working in this space and you need to be making it better. But somewhere where the bulk of the disconnect is with a large part of the workforce that are the middle managers that aren't engaging. And to that note as well, then when you look at the makeup of those middle managers, they're mainly white men across the organization. And I think again, when I get onto what measures, I think you need to know the makeup of your workforce. You need to know what roles people have to then start driving some meaningful change. And society isn't reflected in company leadership. I think if people take a look at who their exec leadership teams are and their senior managers in any community, do they look at those people and then think they're an accurate reflection of the clients or the communities that they operate in? And it won't change overnight, but I think you need to be aware of where you're at now and where you're trying to get to, because if you start throwing in millions of pounds into schemes to try and make the workplace more inclusive, and you have external companies coming in to try and do a pulse check, and you're engaging in all these qualitative measures, and you get 5 years down the line and your entire senior leadership team hasn't changed, was any of it worth it? So on that point, jumping to measures that I've seen working and some things that haven't. Again, I'll show my bias and talk about data. I just think it's fundamental to know what your workforce looks like, who has what roles. So again, once you've got the base layer of information, and it's by no means an easy task, it's difficult to collect this data depending on what country you're in and what areas you operate in, but just because it's difficult doesn't mean it can't be done. And I think from there, you can look at your starting point and say, okay, fine, this is our demographic and we've got X number of Black employees, but then the next step as well is to look at the roles that they're doing. How far up the organization are they? Are they in support and admin roles? What's that breakdown? Because I think a lot of the times you can kind of check the box and say, okay, we've got Black people working for us. They're not in positions that are going to change the direction of the business or have any impact. So I think the first thing is to understand your workforce demographic and know where to go next. Other things, I think, so as well as having the data, you do also need to talk to your employees and see how they're feeling. I think when people voice that they're not comfortable talking about race at work, or they wouldn't speak to their manager or flag an issue to do with race, that again is indicative of poor company culture. Do you have an independent speak up line that's separate to HR or direct management reporting line, so someone can report in confidence that there's a problem? And what do you do with that data? Do you then try and fix the problem, or do you try and get the person that caused the issue? Because I know a lot of people won't speak up because it's kind of at the point where, oh, I've just got this job, things are fine, you know what, I'm just going to try and deal with it. Which isn't really an acceptable way of dealing with any, whether it's outright racial slurs or microaggressions. I don't think that's the best way. So I think an independent way of reporting and monitoring what's going on is also really important. And then also, I think tying it into business strategy, making it front and center of everyone's mind and realizing that this involves everyone. As mentioned before, I think when you have communities or small pockets of the business or networks, you might have the women's network and the women in there know what the issues are. You might have the working parents network, the working parents there know what the issues are. Same with ethnic minorities. The people in those groups know what a lot of the issues are, but they don't necessarily have the influence to change the business as a whole, and it's normally the business as a whole that need to change. So if it's something that's front and center of this new strategy of a business, it needs to be written down somewhere with tangible outcomes that people can address and monitor and measure and work towards. So if someone asks you 2 years down the line, how is it going? You can come back and say, well, X, Y, Z versus ABC, where we were when we started. And I think, whilst I don't agree with just making flashy statements, and we've seen many of them on social media for the past few weeks, there was Blackout Tuesday and many companies just putting statements out and then not really following it up. I don't think that's necessarily the way forward, but I do think writing down tangible steps, what are you going to do? Where are you going next? One of my previous employers, Lloyd's, I think is one of the first companies to publicly announce their race action plan, which includes publishing their ethnicity pay gap, commitment to having more Black people in senior roles. And I don't think goals need to be perfect. I think a lot of people are a bit worried about how to put things down on paper and where do we start. But I think the important thing is that we do start, and you can't report on ethnicity pay gaps either externally or internally if you don't actually know the makeup of your company. And I think it's important because whilst we want diversity of thought from different types of people, you also need diversity of people within the business. And to Frank's point as well, if everyone you're bringing in is trying to fit like the one size fits all model, your company's not going to be as impactful and as profitable as it could be if you're actually trying to work towards the goal of inclusion and getting a breakdown of an accurate representation of society. So my main takeaways, I think, would be to kind of look internally, what does your workforce actually look like and where are you trying to get to? Who are the people that are putting in the hours to try and drive this change? Are they people that sit within D&I and HR as it should be, or is it a lot of people that are doing it side of desk, many of whom are willing to do so? And I think that's fine, I think that's important, but also recognizing that all of them have an 100% full-time day job doing other things that needs to be taken into account as well. And then do you want your company to be leading, I think, is the other thing. We know, especially now, the climate is changing, it's challenging. And as Frank made the point, there's a clear way that you can get ahead. There's a plethora of research out there to move forward. why is it that we seem to be a little bit resistant to doing so? And I know it's not easy or straightforward at all, but some people's feet seem to be firmly rooted in position at the moment with little forward traction, despite knowing that there's a clear way for them to be a leader in their industry. So I'll pause there, and I think we're jumping to Q&A, but those were the main points that I wanted to cover today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Celia. Really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who's already submitted questions. We've had some really good ones coming through. And Frank, I know you've been answering them as we go, but I think there are a few to pull up on and run through in a bit more detail. So one particularly interesting question that's come out is the concept of assimilation and how that differs from real inclusion. And Frank, I think one of the questions from here before was, how do you actually challenge assimilation once you recognize it within an organization?
Well, it's, you know, I have a point of view, and so all my answers unfortunately gravitate back to that point of view, which is that it starts with the CEO and it starts with leadership. It is not necessarily a grassroots effort. And so if your CEO is committed to true diversity and true inclusion, they will set the organization on that path of the change in culture, the challenge to their systems, the challenge to their policies and their procedures. And that will be the roadmap of moving from assimilation to inclusion. Most systems are based on assimilation, and that's what they create. So it's not something that I think you can easily challenge on, because it's not an initiative. It's not a transactional issue. It's a strategic decision that the organization makes to say that we're going to radically challenge the underlying assumptions of how we do things. That's not something you can usually do from the bottom up. It's something that the CEO and the leadership team has to recognize is important to us, and we're going to set the organization on that course.
We've talked about the need for the CEO to really buy in and drive these initiatives in order for them to be truly successful. We've got a lot of people from the HR community on the call who are trying to bring this front and center for that CEO and to make that point. And I think there's a real spectrum of how keen or aware CEOs are of wanting to do this. For those people in HR who want to put this on the CEO's plate and encourage more action, you've already mentioned the McKinsey research and the business case there. Have you seen anything else that's worked well to bring this front and center for the CEO and make them do more in this area?
Yeah, Rob, there's no silver bullet. I mean, you can bring a horse to water that you can't make him drink. And so if the data is out there, and the data says that as a CEO, you can create higher shareholder returns, higher financial results, higher return on investment, higher margins, higher competitor advantage. I don't know. I mean, the question is, with those compelling issues, why don't CEOs believe the data? So I would say that's the first question. Why do CEOs and quite honestly, why do group HR directors not believe the data? So I would sit down at a leadership team meeting and I would start with, okay, we're going to talk about inclusion and diversity. You know, do we believe the data? That's the first question. Do we believe the data? Yes or no? If we believe the data and it's a yes, let's mobilize this organization and let's get moving. And if they say, nah, we believe everything McKinsey says, but we don't believe them on this one, that's fine. That's fine. But that's the question. That is the most fundamental question. Do you believe the data? And so if you want to have a conversation with your CEO, throw them all the McKinsey, Harvard, BCG, LSE, you name it, reports, and ask them, why don't you believe it, boss?
Great. And then looking at the next step of that journey, if you have been able to influence internally and you have a CEO or a leadership team who's saying, we're all in, we want to make improvement here. You both touched upon areas to improve and generate a more inclusive culture, particularly talking about the onboarding and early phase. Are there any other key takeaways that you could give to people who are on this webinar who may be thinking, we want to change, but we don't really know how to? Are there any first steps that both of you would suggest?
I think tracking it and having objectives. There's objectives for all parts of the business, across whether it's if someone's in a sales role, like their sales roles that they need to, the sales targets, sorry, that they need to make. And whilst I'm not saying targets need to be in the objectives of middle management, but there should be a piece around diversity and inclusion in that, something that can be measured, something that can be monitored. How else do you get them on board? Because obviously it's not worked by choice. If it had worked by choice and everyone was engaged, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So as Frank said, once the CEO is on board, and I made the point before, often the very top of the business might be engaged, but then how do you break that down to the levels below them? How does that then trickle down to the rest of the company, the other decision makers, the other people managers? How do they then become on board and engaged as well? And I think you soon realize, if people aren't interested or it's not important to them, then are they then fitting in with the company culture that you're trying to have? And then how do you move forward in that space as well?
No, I agree with that. And I think the other thing is you have to start out with the humility and the intellectual curiosity to find out what we don't know. So, I mean, my bio, I mean, has my clients. I mean, me and my partner, Jennifer, we work with companies from the BBC to ITV to Bloomberg to Warner Music to Viacom, CBS to Hogan Lovells, Pfizer. And we do the same thing with each company. We start out by holding a mirror back to the organization. We speak to their employees and their lived experience of what it's like when you walk in the door at 9 and when you leave at 6. Because we find with every company, it's contextual. That's why these bolt-on D&I approaches don't work. They're not contextual to the organization. And so having spoken to the employees and understanding their lived experience, the first thing we do with an organization and the CEO and their leadership team and the HR team is we hold a mirror back up to the organization. Forget what your website says, forget what your policies are, forget what your practices are. This is what your staff say it's like to work here and what your culture is. And so you have to hold that mirror back up. That's the first step. It's not just a survey. You have to hold the mirror back up and let them see what their leadership style and behaviors and the shadow they cast over the organization is. That's what our clients do, because they recognize otherwise they're checking their own homework. And so the first step is to really reflect and have that humility and curiosity to ask the question, what are we really like as an organization?
We've had some great questions on a continuation of the topic then. So from Comfort Fabian, so with some companies that have never had to collate this data, how do you get them to collect it? And is it about emphasizing this profitability, or are there any first pieces of data that you would say without those pieces of data, you can't hold that mirror up?
I think, again, so it's not simple, it's not straightforward. If you've never had this data, it might take a while to collect it. But if you keep putting it off, it's just going to take even longer. So you've got to start ASAP, I suppose, in this space. And again, before you even try and do the breakdown of roles and levels, what do my employees look like? And if you don't have that base level of information, then how are your inclusion policies or your diversity ideas moving? How are you going to implement them if you don't actually know what the breakdown of your workforce is, especially if you're global, kind of in which countries, how are things, is it representative of the communities that you work in? And again, I guess in IT, you have different backgrounds and breakdowns, but you need to know who sits across your company and what roles before you can start trying to push forward and improve, because you don't really know what you're improving from, if that makes sense.
If I could just add to that, Rob, and Celia is much more polite than I am.
I'm still early days, you've got to be careful.
Is that American in me? I don't think you need a sophisticated data collection. I mean, I think not having the data is an excuse. So here's my simple data collection process for you. Next time, and most major companies have this, next time you have your top 50 or your top 100 leadership meeting. Most companies have at least something once a year with their top 50. Next time you have your top 50 leadership meeting, look at that audience and count how many Black and Asian people are in that top 50 meeting. there's your data. There's your business case. There's your reality. Because in most FTSE companies and most companies in that top 50, you're going to be doing well if you have 5. You'll probably be on average if you have 2 or 3 in that top 50. You don't need much more data than that. You don't, you look around and say, we're in London, it's 40% Black and Asian, and I got 2 senior people in my top 50. There's your question. There's your intellectual curiosity. There's your motivation for saying, okay, something's got to change. I want my next top 50 meeting in 3 years to be totally different looking. You don't have to survey and integrate your employee database for thousands of employees. Look at your top 50, because that's the leadership, that's the organization right there.
Right, and we've got time for a few last questions. So last one on the data side, because I think we've talked about it a fair bit, but I know it's something that you both feel passionately about, which is, so how can employers be encouraged to break down BAME statistics and not group them all into one bucket to get a true picture of the workforce? Was a question from Maureen.
Well, first off, the ethnicity pay gap, while it's not mandatory, again, if an organization is serious about this issue, they should have already been on that journey or committed to voluntarily developing a Black and Asian ethnic minority pay gap report. So I'm not sure what the question is trying to get to, but the data is there. It just takes effort to do it. And indeed, if the government mandates it, you'll have to do it anyway. If the issue is more about segmenting Black and Asian and ethnic minority, that's a different conversation. But in terms of getting the data, it's in most companies' databases. It just takes effort to find it and to look at it. So again, this is not very complicated to me. If there's a will, there's a way. If you're interested in it, you can get the data. If you're not interested, you can come up with all sorts of barriers for not integrating your database about it.
So I think Maureen's just clarified it's about the segmentation and to what extent this is a BAME, BAME issue versus should we be looking at breaking that down further and going into different detail in that data?
I think it should be broken down. I think many people now especially take issue with kind of just lumping BAME under one group, and I can't remember who said it, but it was basically a more correct way of just saying not white, and actually the number of different demographics within BAME itself is multiple. There's many, and then when you report on maybe BAME targets, if everybody that's in a senior position is Asian, then you haven't solve the issue of your Black employees at all, because they're not represented either. So I think when you ask people will identify in different ways. But I mean, if someone asks me if I'm Black, I'll say yes. If someone asks me if I'm Asian, I'll say no. So at that level, it's quite easy just to get that level of data, and then companies can see whether there's when they group it under BAME, whether actually you're still leaving the B and BAME behind, so to speak. It needs to be disaggregated. I think it needs to be separated, and then it will uncover, it will likely uncover many holes in the organisation where you realise you don't have any Black representation at all.
Brilliant. And I think then last final question, which I think could summarise as although we're not anywhere near there yet, as the data said earlier, that steps have been taken over the last X years in gender equality. The question here was, is there anything that we can learn about some of the improvement, albeit not getting anywhere near far enough, that can then be applied to ethnic diversity, do we think?
Well, that's an interesting question, because gender and ethnic minority are totally two different dynamics. So let me give you the negative answer, and then I'll give you the positive answer to it. And a negative answer is that gender diversity, and I said respectfully, for organizations was low-hanging fruit. So first of all, it really wasn't gender diversity, it's gender equality, because most companies had a significant number of females in the organization, they were not being promoted proportionate to their workforce statistics. Most CEOs, and it sounds sounds controversial, but most CEOs and most C-suite executives have white females in their professional orbit, and they have white females in their personal orbit. Very few CEOs and C-suite executives have Black or Asian professionals in their professional orbit. There are very few in the C-suite, and even less so in their personal orbit. That distance, that different lived experience creates a totally different discomfort when you're dealing with race. Race is a difficult topic for us to talk about in the country, and it's even more difficult to talk about in a company. So it is a wrong analysis to assume, well, look how well we've done with gender. Well, because every white male knows a white female. It's just part of their life experiences. Not every white male knows a Black male in a professional or personal orbit. And so it's a much more difficult issue. And as Celia even mentioned, that when you just stack that Black, Asian, and even Asian then gets subdivided, it's a much more difficult conversation. The good news is that what has happened with gender is that the CEOs believe the data. So they got the data, they had the reports, they had Helen Morrissey and others in the 30% club, and they believed the data. And so they mobilized the organization around their HR policies, their recruitment processes, to make sure and to ensure that we are bringing in female talent and we're promoting them as much as we can. The CEOs made that decision. So the lesson to be learned is if the CEOs make that same decision on ethnic diversity, then yes, we might see the same progress on gender. But the difference is they made a commitment on gender and they are silent for the most part on ethnic diversity.
Thanks, Frank. Any last final thoughts from your end, Celia?
I think I echo exactly what Frank said, and obviously with gender diversity, it's close to a 50-50 split. So if you're far away from that, then you know that there's massive problems. Again, breaking down to ethnicity is more complicated, and there's then many sections within each ethnic group in terms of how do you actually get that information about people and the breakdown. But that being said, it's driven by the tone from the top and the commitment. And again, if the CEO takes a stance and then they filter that down to the middle management and people understand that you have to be on board, and if you're not, then it's not part of the company that leaders are striving to have, then you soon realize that actually it might not be the company you thought it was. So I think people need to, it's the tone for the top, it's that level of engagement, it's that level of commitment, it's having steps written down of what you're doing, tangible actions, things that can be measured, things that can be monitored, because it's all nice and good saying we want to be more inclusive. What does that actually mean? What does that look like? And I think Frank made a brilliant point of actually just get in a room and look at your exec leaderships. When you've got a PDF of all the faces of people that are on your different teams across the different committees, you should be able to pull out the ones that are Black and the ones that aren't. And like you said, if you're counting more than 5 out of 50, you're probably doing pretty well.
Well, thank you both so much. And I think I've just noticed a comment on the Zoom chat from Clive who said that whilst what we've talked about here on gender is correct, there's still also far too far to go on gender equality and equity as well. So
it's not great if you're in both. So if you're in an intersectionality, then the problem is increased. So there's a lot of, we've not even touched on that, but again, if you're a woman and you're an ethnic minority, then it's twofold. So the problems are growing, but I think there's also ways to solve them. So I think you've got to look at where we've got to, but also understand that there's plenty of room for progress.
Absolutely, and talking about the issue and everyone joining and focusing on it today is hopefully a good start there, and everyone can take something away. So thanks so much for your time. It just leaves me to wrap up. I just wanted to finish off by saying another massive thank you to both Frank and Celia for what I thought were fascinating talks. Frank, I particularly found the difference between equality and equity, as well as the difference between inclusion and assimilation, really insightful. And Celia, your personal lived-in experience as a person who scored 0 on Frank's four-part scale, which we've been asked for, by the way, so we'll send that through as part of the follow-up, was really enlightening to hear your experience. So we'll be sending around a feedback form. We'd love to hear your thoughts so we can continue to improve our webinars. And if you enjoyed today's session, we've got more webinars coming up and resources that could be useful. So just a quick shout out on those. The next webinars in our series on diversity and inclusion are on changing perspectives on diverse talent, which is on the 25th of August. We'll be touching upon the sensitivity of language. VWV, a leading law firm, will also provide the legal perspective on positive action and positive discrimination, and we'll be challenging leadership preconceptions, which has been a big topic we've discussed today. We'll then be looking at building the business case for diversity, which, as Frank has said, is very crystal clear looking at the McKinsey numbers, but we're looking at how to influence internally and going into that in more detail as we build the commercial case for diversity and inclusion, as well as the metrics that every business should put in place to track success and lead to ongoing improvement in this area. We also ran a webinar last week on preparing for the future of work post-lockdown, and you can find all of our webinar recordings and other resources on the resources page of our website. If you haven't seen it already, there's also the Diversity Hub there, which has a number of short videos on the topic of driving diversity, and that's also on our website. I just wanted to finish off with a thought, which is there's never been as good a time to make huge strides on diversity and inclusion. CEOs, politicians, and the country at large have never been as engaged with this important topic. And although there's a hell of a long way to go, please don't wait around, because one of two things will happen. Either, God forbid, the world will move on and we'll lose momentum, or companies will act and yours will be the one playing catch up and explaining to your employees, as well as potential future hires, why you're so slow to act. So let's all be brave. Let's be the first ones to act. And thank you so much again for joining us today. We hope to see you next time.